What is a Jew? A Jew is someone with an identity crisis. A Jew is someone who can't give you a straight answer as to whether they are the member of a family, a clan, an ethnic group, or the adherent of a religion who's committed to certain practices and beliefs. Why do Jews have that identity crisis? Well, part of it is because Jews are old. Jews hark back to the ancient world, a time when ethnicity and religion were fused, when inseparable components of one's identity were the group that one belonged to and the religious life that formed the civilization of that group. In that world, one cannot meaningfully convert to a religion or enter into a group that is not one's own ethnic background. While in the ancient world it was possible for a non-Israelite woman to marry into a patriarchal Israelite family and thereby be absorbed, a non-Israelite man could no more become an Israelite than I could become ethnically Chinese. The definition was one grounded in a bloodline, a chain of descent that grounds one in a specific people. And so it was for hundreds of years, until along came Alexander the Great. And Alexander conquered the known world at the time, the Middle East and beyond, and created something that humanity had never really seen before, which was a multi-ethnic civilization. An empire, a world in which people of different ethnicities who spoke different languages not only lived side by side, but in fact made up the same polity, the same culture, and the same civilization. For the first time, even though my parents were not Greek, I could speak the Greek language, I could dress like a Greek, I could participate in Greek culture and study Greek philosophy, and I could be a member of a city or a state with a Greek constitution. And this set up a new reality in which ethnicity was now decoupled from religion. This plunged the Jewish people into an identity crisis from which we have not recovered until today. And it is as if Alexander asked the Jewish community, in this brave new world, what will you be? Will you be an ethnic group defined by bloodline and kin and clan? Or will you be a civilization of sorts, a religion, a set of practices and commitments that will define the boundaries of your community? We have struggled with that for many, many centuries. And when one looks at the long tradition of rabbinic Judaism, its communities, its mores, its laws, and its texts, one finds that in fact Alexander's question and challenge to us has been responded to in two different ways. And we find two different strands of thinking about what it is that makes up a Jew. For many sources, we hear the strong voice of Judaism as an ethnic quality, and the essence of Judaism being ethnicity, you might say Jews being defined by blood, by bloodline and descent. The idea that ultimately the Jewish community is anchored in a certain genetic notion of peoplehood. Many sources weigh in on this. One of the most shocking and to the point is a statement by Rabbi Chelbo, a third-generation sage from the land of Israel, who says, Kashim gerim liyisrael kesapachat. Converts are as terrible for Israel as a rash. A statement that grates on our ears today and is hard to appreciate at first, but which is a direct claim that on some level, when an outsider comes in to the Jewish ancestral community, there is some destabilizing, some weakening, some threatening of the non-negotiable bonds of family that serve as the anchor for the non-negotiable covenant between God and the Jewish people. And there are legal corollaries to this stance as well. Perhaps most notably, the Mishnah in Bikurim, one of the earliest rabbinic texts that reflects on how converts to Judaism should pray in the synagogue. And it notes that, among other things, the very common phrase that Jews say every day, Elohei Avotenu, the God of our ancestors, is not to be uttered by a convert. The convert should say instead, Elohei Avot Yisrael, the God of the ancestors of Israel, of an ethnic group of which I am not a member. When you think about Judaism as an ethnicity, as an ethnic quality, it also stands to reason, and shouldn't be surprising, that that determines how one thinks about those who are born Jewish, but who decide to leave Jewish practice, to abandon Jewish commitments, what we often refer to as apostates, those who leave the Jewish community, perhaps even embracing another religious life. And we find there many medieval sources that offer the kind of parallel statement to Rabbi Chelbo, instead talking about apostates and saying about them, Af al pi shechata Yisraelhu. Jews, even when they sin and go astray, and perhaps even adopt an entirely different religious framework, remain Jews. Just as my brother or my sister could commit the most heinous of crimes and be locked up in a maximum security prison, but they would still be my brother or my sister, so too, say these authorities, a Jew who has even committed the ultimate heresies remains a Jew, because this is, at the end of the day, an ethnic quality. And a legal corollary of this are the medieval sources that talk about marriage between apostates and the kinds of children that apostate marriages will produce. And Rabbi Vidal de Tolosa, known as the Magid Mishneh in 14th century Spain, says very clearly, the two apostates have Jewish children. A young boy raised as a Christian by two Jews who willingly converted to Christianity can marry a Jewish woman without the need to convert or go through any kind of process. This is what it means to think about Judaism as an ethnic quality, as something that is grounded in the non-negotiable nature of whom we are descended from. Now, this is, of course, only one way of thinking about this. And one could respond to Alexander's challenge very differently. And instead of saying, yes, we will continue to be an ethnic people defined by bloodline, instead to think of ourselves more seriously in light of conversion as being a religion, something that can be adopted by anyone as a matter of choice. And here, too, we find some very different statements and very different voices in the tradition. Another 3rd century sage, Reish Lakish, opines in one midrash, in one classical text, that in fact converts are more beloved than Israel when they stood at the foot of Mount Sinai. Why? Because Israel at the foot of Mount Sinai only accepted the terms of the covenant because of the thunder and lightning and frightening nature of the divine revelation. Whereas the convert comes along without any compulsion whatsoever to take this step, and nonetheless chooses to adopt it as a mission, as their sense of purpose in life, and to join the Jewish framework of living and its relationship with God. Says Reish Lakish, what could possibly be more beloved than that? When you think about Judaism as a religion, converts don't become the exception that must be tolerated, but they in fact become the paradigm of what it means to be a committed Jew. And here, too, there are legal corollaries, various sources that fight back against the Mishnah and its theories about how converts should pray, culminating in a statement by Maimonides in the Middle Ages, ordering the convert who consults with him to pray in the identical language to any born Jew, because he, like anyone else, can say, Elohei Avotenu, the God of our ancestors, because he is descended from Abraham. Not by blood, but because he is a spiritual heir to the mission that Abraham accepted when God reached out to him. Now, as you can imagine, if you think that way about people coming in, there ought to be consequences for thinking about Jews who abandon Judaism on the way out. And here, too, we also have different ways of thinking about apostates when we turn to the question of Judaism as being a religious quality and essence. Apostates, according to this view, in fact, become Gentiles. The most striking formulation of this sort is that offered by 12th and 13th century Provençal rabbis, who prescribe that those Jews who publicly violate the Sabbath are in fact legally incapable of contracting Jewish marriage with observant Jews. And their reason's very simple. If the Bible says that the Sabbath will be the sign between God and the Jewish people, someone who does not observe the Sabbath is therefore clearly not a Jew. Apostates, then, when you think from the framework of religion and of thinking about Jews as being Jews by choice, suddenly are not defined in any way by their bloodline, and the fact of their Jewish parents is irrelevant to determining whether they are meaningful members of the Jewish community. And this is a very different strand that answers Alexander in an entirely different way, saying, indeed, we will be a religion and defined by practice and by commitment. The world in which we live and the world of subsequent rabbinic sources is not as simple as either of these poles. These poles are archetypes that are useful for thinking about what is at stake when we conceive of Judaism as either being an ethnic or a religious proposition. But the reality is that for rabbinic Judaism, we live in a world in which those two overlap. Ethnicity and religion never totally erase the other, but somehow live in an uncomfortable intersection that combines aspects of both. You can see this very simply by two truths that are taken for granted by anyone who is involved in anything resembling rabbinic Judaism from antiquity down till the present. The first is the simple truth that no matter what one's standards of conversion are, or how much one encourages or does not encourage it in one's community, everyone in that framework understands that conversion is a possibility. Anyone who accepts the notion that you can convert into Judaism has somewhat, to some degree, abandoned the idea that Judaism is about ethnicity alone. Because the idea that I, without any Jewish ancestry, can nonetheless step into this story means I have broadened my definition of what it means to be a Jew beyond bloodline. But perhaps more striking is the fact that for all of the infighting in the Jewish community regarding who is a Jew, I am not yet aware of anyone in any denomination or community or framework who disputes the idea that someone born to two Jews is assumed to be a Jew. Even though that very definition is, of course, an ethnic one defined by bloodline. Birth alone tells you nothing about a person's religion or about their commitments. All it tells you is what family they are a part of. And given that we live in a world where both of those assumptions hold, you can see that we don't live in a world that in fact separates these two categories the way perhaps Alexander invited us to. Where are we in our present moment? In our present moment, we live in a world that has its ethnic pole and ethnic elements fading. This is true both internally in the Jewish community, as intermarriage and increasing racial diversity within the Jewish community simply make it less and less plausible as the years go by to see some kind of clear ethnic picture in the Jewish community. It's also particularly true in the larger culture of the 21st century American diaspora, where an increasingly post-ethnic American society does not think in ethnic terms in the same way that it once did, and one's ancestry and one's heritage simply does not define the limits of one's possibilities and integration into society the way it once did. In that world, one of the lessons for us is that Jews are going to have to get used to talking and thinking more than perhaps they have in the past in terms of the religious paradigm than the ethnic paradigm. Part of what that means is when you are talking about everyone being a Jew by choice, you have to have a much clearer sense of what is the mission and purpose and message of living a kind of life, as opposed to self-evident theories of who is in or out of the group. And it also means that those who in an open and free society make choices to leave and to abandon Jewish practice perhaps have to be taken a little bit more at their word than we're accustomed to. That actually, maybe they're not, in fact, interested or invested in being in that larger project of Jewish life. But what I really want you to take away from this brief survey of thinking about the essence of Judaism is that we are probably truest to our biblical and our rabbinic roots by refusing Alexander's proposition of separating these two categories. Instead, to say that part of what has in fact made Judaism brilliant throughout the centuries has been its full-on embrace of being simultaneously both an ethnicity and a religion, and neither. Because after all, there is nothing quite as powerful as being in a non-negotiable relationship of family in a way that you know no matter what happens, that relationship is there as the ultimate anchor of a covenant that transcends time and space. But it also must be that if we are to stand for anything and for any meaning that is to be compelling in the contemporary world, it must be that those who choose to join that mission midway through have to be able to find a way to become full and active players in that unfolding drama.